Welcome, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome Diego and Mateo here to this wonderful Haffenreffer event. I've known Diego and Mateo for I think about 20 years, and I've watched them develop as artists and as social critics and commentators, both on the field of archaeology and anthropology, but also on contemporary society. The video that we're going to share with you right now is a wonderful engagement, and we'll talk about it after we look at it together. So if we can begin the video, that would be great. Well, what an amazing film. You guys are muted. Let me just remind you. So I have a lot of questions. I want to ask you a little bit more about how it came about. Where was it filmed outside of Santa Fe? How did you create the special effects?
It should be in the intro for dummies in Anthro 101, right?
Yeah, it should be.
Anthro for dummies, yeah.
Yeah. What feedback have you received? And what if you have against arugula? And you can answer any of those questions in any order you like.
Gee, go. Okay, well, it's a critique of the archaeological practices, as we discussed a little bit earlier, Western civilization's archaeological approach, and I guess kind of a callous disregard for the cultural, I guess the spirit of the land and the peoples that are descended from these cultures, and kind of, I guess it's kind of a poke at the pot hunter as a treasure hunter. It was I mean, it's done on a shoestring budget, and it's really tongue in cheek. And it was a supplement to a show we did at the time, which me and my brother kind of were, which it's interesting because now actually this kind of critique has come to the forefront, and there's a whole decolonized movement in the museums. But this was probably done about 17 years ago, I would say. And back then it was, we were just kind of on the cusp of re-examining these new paradigms of a Western approach to archaeology and museum and pot hunting and excavating and respect for the cultures that were there. So that's kind of where the film came out of, was this kind of just an examination into how this was all done, and it's done with a kind of humor approach to it, because that's how me and my brother approach things. I've often found that you can get your point across with humor. So whereas people won't listen to, they might not be as open to your opinions, but if you present it with a certain tongue in cheek or a certain humorous approach, then people will look at that and, oh, it's kind of, maybe they'll re-examine, their thought process.
It's critique, it's got this huge overlay of kind of slapstick humor. It's kind of goofy almost, because we didn't really have money for the movie. We just kind of put it all together, but it does have, there's serious critique in the movie. Some of the motifs that we talk about are, so my brother and I basically dress up like these sort of period British,
Archaeologists.
Yeah, archaeologists, and we have the coolie. We have like a local Pueblo coolie, and we go out and dig up the pots. But
we awake the spirit.
Yeah, we actually
that's the whole point
that's
of
the Buffalo
it, right? It's a cautionary tale, right? That's actually taken from a Maurice Sendak book. I Don't Care, called Pierre. So it's kind of like
it's children's tales for anthropologists.
Right. It's kind of like designed like a children's book for
parable anthropologists.
That's right.
That's
so
it's great.
A cautionary tale. It's right at the beginning, and
but that is what happens. So throughout the film, like these natives dressed up as anthros are digging things up. They're dressed up like they're archaeologists, but they're digging things up, and the spirit of the land becomes the Buffalo Man is the spirit of the land. He becomes awakened because people are walking on the sacred space, the ancestors, and they're physically penetrating the ground and pulling the objects of the burial objects, the Mimbres pots, and the kind of which are actually jackalopes. They're Mexican pottery that we had painted up as and I'm actually I would have, if I did it again, I'd actually come in tighter on the pots, because the pots were kind of cool. People actually collected the pots later on as part of the kind of, I don't know, people were just interested in them because they're kind of funky and weird. and the spirit of the land becomes awakened. And so throughout, so there's the critique is that, the land's not to be disturbed. The land is sacred. It's inviolate. And then people come from outside, a culture that comes outside and consumes. It sort of, excavates and extracts and commodifies. And the ultimate commodification is the end where they take the pots to the vault, right? Where the pots wind up in the vault.
Kind of in an Indiana Jones, right?
Yeah. And the whole thing is,
we filmed that whole last scene backwards. There was
you might not be able to tell. Yeah. We actually walked backwards.
So there's actually this
yeah.
scene in Shadow of the Vampire when he films a scene. He says, "Oh, if I was thinking, I would have filmed it backwards." And he goes, "Your esoteric filmmaking techniques are not needed on this film, no." But that's where we got that whole concept, was to film the scene backwards. But you can't tell. But it actually was. We actually started at the inside the
we started inside the vault,
and
walked backwards. It's actually not exaggerated enough, because we're not filmmakers, so our craft is kind of weak.
We're not filmmakers.
We're not filmmakers,
but we're storytellers.
The ideas, I think, are interesting. About the kind of people are talking about this colonial discourse and decolonized museums and decolonized museum practices and collection practices, and there's there's a different air about it, but 17 years ago,
people weren't talking about it.
People weren't talking about this, and we actually got pushback from members of the museum community on it, because people didn't dig it. They thought we were being overly critical and being mocking people, but really the heart of it is this perspective of a Pueblo person and their relationship to the ground and the ancestors and the pottery and the bones that are actually, the bodies of the ancestors that are interred there. That's the skull reference, about this excavation of the skull and later like phrenological skull measurements and all this stuff that happens. And it's, on the surface, you might look at it and think it's comical or something, it's goofy, but these are actually, this is a legitimate perspective, which has sort of been couched in the rhetoric of humor. But if you talk to Pueblo people about how they view the lands and the living land and their embodiment in the land, their connection to the the spirit world and the ancestors and the living space, these are all living ideas in a living culture, which doesn't want people going into the ground and pulling things out. And so the critiques are that these are harmful actions, they unbalance the spirit world. The buffalo character is the spirit of unrest, it's the spirit of disquiet. It's the ancestors responding in a disturbed fashion.
That was also a fellow artist.
That's Marcus Ammerman.
Yeah.
His Buffalo Man.
A hat tip.
Yeah, he has a great character. He's a fantastic artist. And, he's known for his beadwork, but he also has this Buffalo Man character that is kind of a performative character that shows up over and over again. So we use Marcus Ammerman with the Buffalo Man to be the spirit of the awakened ancestor.
And you can see kind of how at the final scene, right? It's like, is he there or is he not, right? The camera pans by him and there's a double take and he's gone. So we I mean, it's all, we try to be sensitive to everything. I mean, I guess, except for the actual paradigms we're critiquing, but it was all done in earnest. It's a little more edgy than I remember it, to be quite frank.
People weren't talking about it so much.
Yeah, people weren't talking.
It wasn't part of
a
mainstream discourse like it is now. There was no internet. There was no social media.
There really wasn't.
People were not discussing it. It's like the MMIW stuff we were doing like 15 years ago.
It's kind of like something you would do in grad. It is like a grad school.
It's kind of rough around the edges. It's a grad student production.
Project. Yeah, it's a bunch of artists that had no training whatsoever in film, or like I said, all we knew is that
it says the script is written by John Torres Nez, but really me and Diego just thought it up. We just kind of came up with a series of ideas.
It was ad-libbed.
We just kind of made it up. It was like a comic book. It was like storyboards in a comic book. We basically just sketched out ideas that kind of roughly touched on what we were.
What about this? What about that? Can you do this? And we tried to do it like with a Charlie Chaplin kind of approach to the old.
It's got the
film.
hand crank.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah,
the references are sort of Murnau and the Nosferatu and the kind of the hand crank. And I think
Yeah.
some versions have the iris in and the iris out, you know,
Yeah,
it's like
yeah.
and that actually wasn't as successfully done as we wanted it to be.
Yeah,
But once
yeah,
again, you know,
well, we're not
really,
actors. I
we-
mean, if
we're
we were
not
to do it
actors,
again, I'd
yeah.
actually get
we'd actually get people to do it. We'd actually
yeah.
get, and maybe have
Yeah,
sound in it and kind of do it differently. But this is maybe like 17 years ago, and it kind of existed in a kind of conceptual space where it was just,
Well, it was a supplement to a show. It was actually,
and it's had much more
yeah.
longevity than the show. The show
Yeah.
is like long since gone, but
Right.
somehow the document kind of lives on in people's minds. Yeah.
What about outtakes? Do any outtakes exist?
It was all shot at once. I mean, it was just
Yeah.
one thing. Yeah, the editing was very straightforward. It was really, you know, you can tell by how rough it is. You can tell by how unpolished it is that there was not a lot of editing.
There
done.
was not, yeah.
It was just done all at once. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was just done in a couple of afternoons, I think. Really, literally. It was just
The most time-consuming part of it was having people come in and paint the pots. We actually had studio assistants that did the pottery for the show, for the shoot, and so we had to create props. The making of the props actually took up more time than I think it was.
Well, Diego, your Homer Simpson idol, you know, that must have taken a little time to make.
that was fun. That, you know, that's a Chia Pet head. And that was actually the first of many. I did that one, and that piece actually belonged to Tony Chavarria, but
Really?
but I did a show. I did several shows. Well, there's a whole like moche stirrup vase tradition, right? Of like so it started a whole thing where I would go down to Walgreens and get a Chia Pet head and put a stirrup vase on it and paint them. And I got better and better at it as I went along. And now I actually they pop up in museums every once in a while. I'll see one here or there. I always get a chuckle. I'll see that whole started out as just a quick movie prop gag for a you know. But anyway, I do those now. I guess I would say professionally, but I don't make a living at it. but I do.
Diego's on Etsy. He's doing Anasazi chia heads on Etsy.
I do the Chia Pet head. There's someone put one on my Instagram not too long back. So there's, anyway, it's a thing. I do those now, and that came out of the movie. So it was just a joke to start out with, going down a jackalopes. And one of the pieces I got, or I don't know if they focused in on it, like my brother said, we should have actually focused more on the pots that we had painted. Some of them were quite amusing. There was an elephant. I remember
there was like a hippo or an elephant.
There was a ceramic elephant. Anyway, we had fun. It was all done with, like I said, and we felt in good humor and with the sensitivity, and we tried to critique the get our critique across. And
from an indigenous perspective, you know, this stuff has been handled for so long by a mainstream non-indigenous culture that we thought it was interesting to kind of bring a native voice back to it and humorously look at it. But the ideas are serious. You know, I did a series of paintings called The Pot Hunters based on this. And The Pot Hunters, in, you know, its core was about the need for non-native cultures to collect the objects, the burial objects of Mimbres and Anasazi people, and to have objects from these spaces, which are sort of, they're kind of forbidden. They're objects that are interred with bodies at the, you know, at a certain part in the funeral process. And it's what Alfonso Ortiz referred to as liminal rites of separation. And, you know, they're like the keelhole pots from Mimbres, you know, history, such coveted items, right? But they're burial goods, they're grave goods. They're items that are made to be interred in perpetuity forever in the ground with the bodies. And you come along and the pot hunter paintings were about these non-natives that were excavating with backhoes and bulldozers in some places and pulling these pots out and selling them. You know, when we first came to this area, maybe like 40 years ago,
It's a thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's a thing. Yeah, you could actually go up to the
people-
flea market and find old members pots with kill holes in them being sold like 40 years ago at the Santa Fe flea market. And every Santa Fe gallery had a back room, 20 years ago, where all this NAGPRA undocumented non-provenance grave goods were situated in the back room. And we would actually talk to people who could go in these places, collectors who had the carte blanche to go back into the safe. Every gallery had a safe, and not just anyone could go into the safe, but certain prestigious collectors could go look at the burial goods and the human remains and things like that. So it's a conversation about that kind of rapacity and the kind of worldview and the value system, where some people feel like they have to go in and excavate this and control it and have it and sell it and buy it and sort of they're titillated by this action. It's this kind of maybe some kind of this bad boy behavior around like doing things which are culturally very insensitive to indigenous people. If you're looking at this from a different point of view, if you're saying like people wanted to dig up the graveyard in Santa Fe at the cathedral and they wanted to take the remains out and throw them in a pile and take all the jewelry and all the objects with value out of the graves that were buried in Santa Fe in a non-native space like the cathedral, people would lose their minds. They'd be like, what are you talking about?
I do think they did that though. I think they did.
Diego thinks they did that. I don't know.
I think but just recently they removed all the
but anyway, so it's that kind of point of view where we just ask the questions. I mean, we don't have answers. We don't have answers. But we're just posing questions.
It might be irresponsible. I don't know. Ask a question that there's no answer to. But
nowadays it seems very mainstream to be kind of pushing back and to be decolonizing and to be sort of woke and all this stuff. But we were actually looking at this maybe like 17, 20 years ago with MMIW, with native burial spaces and graves and things like that. And I mean, we don't have didactic answers about it, but we were just talking about it and doing art about it and kind of trying to raise a discourse about it. It seems very mainstream now. It seems very much, it's discussed everywhere, and it should be. But at the time we did these documents, no one was talking about this. It was actually, it was actually kind of edgy, 20 years ago to do something like this. And people thought maybe even inappropriate in some areas that, people inside these institutions didn't want to be critiqued. They didn't want a sense of humor turned back on them. They didn't want the gaze directed back towards the institutions that were doing this kind of activity or there were repositories of items that had come from this. They didn't want to be looked at that way.
Yeah. Let me ask you a little bit about archaeology and how you both have seen it change over your careers. Both of you are very knowledgeable about Southwestern archaeology, Southwestern history. And there are a lot of archaeologists that have zoomed into your presentation here. And I'm just curious as to your thoughts about the way that you see archaeology changing over time or not.
We're not that knowledgeable about it. To be honest about it, we're very sophomoric, kind of a grad student, put it in the blender and kind of blend it all up and pour it out. We're not that knowledgeable about it.
You know about NAGPRA. You know about the ways in which
NAGPRA. I have a past relationship with NAGPRA.
I don't know, have they changed, right? Okay, look at it. Yeah. So certainly on the surface, there is a presentation where it decolonized in the museum paradigms, right, of decolonization. But that's on the surface. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. Do people still go in? Are there still people down there in South America going into archaeological sites? I'm sure there are, right? So yeah, on the surface, I'm sure things are. There's been an effort to polish over or make things more presentable. And I'm glad. I mean, it's a start, right? I want to say, that's a start, that there is a whole awakening and whole decolonized kind of movement in the museum culture, and that we're having this conversation. I mean, I don't remember ever having a conversation about this film 20 years ago, really, when it was made. So yeah, this is all a good start. let's keep the ball rolling. Let's I do wonder, off camera, so to speak, are how much has changed, right? Do people still go in? And I mean, um, I mean, it's so tricky, right? I mean, I don't want to disrespect all the archaeologists. I know that people do go in and document this stuff, and people are very passionate about it, and it's all safely documented and categorized, and it's all, I read these books myself, so I benefit from this information. So yeah, I guess I'm hypocritical in that sense, but I also at the same time, maybe it would be better if we just didn't do I don't know. I don't have the answers. I really don't.
One thing I can say is just from knowing the collectors who have this type of material in their collections, Diego and I know quite a few of the collectors in this area and regionally, and they've divested themselves of this stuff because it's no longer okay. It's not only is it not okay to have this, but they also can't prove the provenance of any of this stuff. So people we know that have collected artwork in the past who are heavily into this type of material have consciously moved it out of their collections because they understand that with NAGPRA and with provenance, that there is a time is coming when having this type of material without documentation, without provenance established, it'll mean that potentially the value of this will be negligible, that it will no longer be commodified because you won't be able to sell it to anybody without having documentation of how it came about. And so that's actually interesting to me, is that there's an economic incentive with NAGPRA and with discourse like this, which de-incentivizes this kind of activity economically, that people they're not going to spend this large amount of money on a member's pot now because they're thinking 5 years from now, I can't resell this thing because the market will collapse because, of NAGPRA and federal regulation and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Another aspect of it, for me, this might be kind of controversial, but one of the experiences I had as a grad student at UNM was that the anthropologists, non-native anthropologists, and archaeologists who collect this stuff are in love with the objects of the culture, but they don't necessarily love the people in the culture, and they don't connect with the living embodiment of the culture. They fetishize and commodify and write papers and publish books and do lecture and teach classes on the objects of the ethnographic objects and the archaeological objects, but they don't really have love or connection or desire to really connect with the native people. They don't love indigenous people, but they are, they're in a love affair with the objects that come out of the ground.
Yeah, I think you're right. There is certainly that element.
Don't they all write papers on the stuff and they feel like they own these things? Isn't that part of it? Isn't that part of the kind of mainstream anthropological perspective is as a grad student, you write papers on certain artists and certain types of art, and then you feel connected to the objects in the collection that you've published on, and then you feel a certain ownership, right? You feel like, culturally or aesthetically or some kind of literary sense that you somehow own this stuff. But then, actually going through this with people like that on my committees at UNM as a grad student was exhausting. Both Diego and I have been in the experience of talking about these issues and then having people that were non-native, attack us and condemn us and say that, when you talk about these types of things, you're against what you're talking about. So an example would be, as a grad student, I did some work on Cochiti Pueblo, which was about some of the cultural biases that existed in the village. And there's a sign at the front of the village that, it's like every village has like you're entering, this Pueblo and these things are not acceptable. And so I did some stuff with that where I just kind of took things off there and I put things on there and kind of edited it and made it into an art piece. And then it was talking about the values of the people living in that space. And then I was critiqued by people outside the culture as saying I was racist, basically, like, hey, you're against this, right? And I was like, no, I'm making art about the values of the people in the community. I'm not against anyone per se. Diego had the same experience one time with a pot he did, which was depicting a native woman who was a Pueblo woman being raped by a conquistador. And then there was a group of people, they were non-native, who were saying you're pro-rape, and Diego was like, no, I'm talking about the history of this place and what happened, prior to 1680 and how it came to be this way. So I think oftentimes in history, you take artists and they're talking about really sensitive issues in culture, and they're talking about these, very fluid, dynamic social situations. It's very easy to critique them in a negative way and just say, look, these artists are against people, or these artists are racist or sexist, or whatever the fears of the group you're critiquing are, usually get projected back on the artist for talking about those issues in a critique in the art.
Mm-hmm. You both have been interested and influenced by the Pueblo Revolt, and this is obviously a topic I've been interested in for a long time, and some of the people that have zoomed in are also interested in the topic. So I just wanted to just chat with you a little bit about the ways it's influenced your work, the ways you draw from your own history in your particular artistic practices.
Well, I guess for me, well, it's part of the narrative, right? I guess of the basis or the bedrock, I would say, of my narrative in my art, in my work, in the pottery. I would say, there's many genres or many things I touch on. I do environmental, I do political, I do, but at the very basis of it all, I think historical narrative is probably the bedrock of the work, the basis, the ground floor of the whole body of what I do, centers around the I guess I want to say not untold, but certainly a minimalized or history of the Southwest. Not. I was only okay. So you're in school. You open up a book. Okay, page 1, the history of the Americas. Christopher Columbus discovers America.
They're kind of forgotten indigenous histories, right?
Yeah. So anyway, so I like to myself, look a little deeper, look a little further. What are some of these? You can do my own research. I mean, it is out there. You just have to look a little harder. But anyway, so for me, the Pueblo Revolt is a jumping off point for the body of work and the narrative.
But you stress, it seems like you stress the trauma, you stress violence, you really are bringing it forward. You're really trying to make us pay attention to it.
Well, I guess, the relationship between colonizer and the colonized, I guess it's all, I mean, it's all a very human narrative, right? People identify with it. It's not just specific to Pueblo people. Yeah, I'm using the Pueblo Revolt as a jumping off point for my work, but really, this is the history of man, right? The history of humankind. It's always a history of someone bigger and stronger bullying someone that doesn't have, taking their resources, taking their land. I mean, it's just not specific to Pueblo people in the Southwest. This is the history of the human race going back to Mesopotamia, right? We've always been a right bunch of vicious little monkeys that just beat up our neighbors and take their stuff. I'm trying to say this as best I can without any profanity.
Part of the history of the Pueblo Revolt, which is so interesting, is that it happened here. It happened in Santa Fe. We're actually speaking to you from Cara Romero's studio in Santa Fe.
Yeah.
We're about 3 blocks from the plaza right now. There's a Cara Romero photograph behind us. You can see that. It's a beautiful piece. But the point I'm trying to make, the Pueblo Revolt was ground zero here. The governor's complex which has the Palace of the Governors, which is one of the wings of the plaza in Santa Fe, was actually part of the Pueblo Revolt. There was open warfare at 1680 in that space.
Yeah.
The rivers were dammed, the Carries and Tewa people gathered, the war parties gathered here. The Santa Fe River was dammed. There was open warfare. The slave district of Analco, which is just across the river, Santa Fe River, across from the governor's bar, was actually, you know, it was razed. There was fire. There was people.
A siege.
There was a siege.
There was,
Yeah.
like,
People were actually digging holes in the walls
siege,
and moving, you know, through the spaces in Analco in the slave district, which was being burned. Yeah. There were harbiscues and muskets being fired and bows and arrows, and people were being lynched.
Hurling insults.
Yeah, people were being lynched on the eaves of the governor's palace. You know, there was massive violence, physical violence, and this is an untalked about history of Santa Fe. You know, people come here.
Yeah, it seems very much overlooked. Right?
It's forgotten. It's forgotten history.
Yeah,
it's a forgotten history of
I
Santa
mean,
Fe.
you know,
People talk about
Gettysburg, or people talk about, I guess, you know, they're or I guess the what's the one with Custer? I mean, there's big focal points in history, and
this is one of our focal points.
This is one of our, yeah.
But and so there's this moment of tremendous, you know, physical violence that these Pueblo people have been subjugated to sexual bondage and rapine and lynchings, and all this stuff has happened to them. The religion's been repressed. The medicine societies.
There was a tax, the Encomida.
The Encomienda system and the Finega system were imposed. Just very ruthless, vicious systems of colonial oppression. The bodies of the Pueblo people were subject to commodification, violence, sexual violence, forced servitude. The weavings stopped. Pueblo embroidery stops at one point because it's all confiscated during the encomienda system, right? So these people just stopped doing it because they're like, you know, we make these incredibly elaborate textiles, but they just get taken from us.
All those great old pots, those big oyas, those are
actually
measurements.
They're referred to as Finega.
For a tax.
They're taxation measurements.
Each pot is a measurement.
It's a Finega.
Grain that was.
It's a measurement of grain in the encomienda system. Yes. So this is a response. The 1680 revolt is a response to this. It's one of the only revolts I'm aware of that's successful against the colonial superpower.
They actually did drive them out.
They did drive them out. They drove them out to from here. They went initially. They went to, I think, was it
back to Mexico? I think, right?
I think they wind up in Mexico.
But the irony, of course, is that they do come back 12 years later.
Right.
They do come back when the Pueblos are in a weakened state, and there's a reconquest, which was not bloodless. It's always painted out as the bloodless reconquest, where, you know, these UNM Hispanic history teachers always want to say that you know, it was bloodless and we came back. It was not bloodless. There was actually another siege which happened, and this siege is during the Reconquest, and it was principally Tewas who were living around the area of Upper Crust Pizza, where that church is, and that was actually a stockade, and that was sieged during the Reconquest, and hundreds of Tewa people were murdered at that point, some of which were burned alive in their kivas. They were actually incinerated, huddled in kivas at that spot where that Upper Crust Pizza on that church is on.
So there is a history of resistance.
There's a history of resistance, but in the broadest possible terms, like Diego touched on, you know, this is a regional specific story of the Pueblo people, but it's actually a human story. It's a human condition, right? So everyone, essentially, unless you're some kind of economic elite at this point, unless you're part of the 1%.
Well, I mean, it goes back to the Celts and the Romans, right? I mean, there's always some formidable
the point I'm trying to make is
trying to oppress, you know, the indigenous people of the land, whether it's Romans and Celts or whether it's we won't get into it.
Part of my critique is that now this has been translated onto everybody in terms of economic peonage, economic serfdom. You know, if you study, you know, basically, there's no need to colonize people in this kind of physical, the jig is up for physical colonization, moving into people's space and sort of, attacking them physically, taking the land, killing people. That's the history of this place. That's the Native experience in America. That's the Black experience as being enslaved in Africa and brought here to work the plantation fields for cotton and tobacco. So there is a history of utilizing, colonizing in this kind of vicious.
Okay, so so I want to add. I mean, I don't even know if it's history. I mean, we just pulled out of Afghanistan, right? I mean, we up until a month ago, I mean, it's still it's the current paradigm.
It continues.
Yeah,
it has different forms. There's different forms of this sort of rapacity, this consumption, but it continues. And I would actually say that it continues even beyond the borders of indigeneity. As Indigenous people, as Native people, we're always ground zero for this, because we're the front line. We're the first ones to be on top of the land that has the oil underneath it. We're the first ones to be on top of the land that has the pottery buried in it. We're always the first ones to get, we're the first ones that they want to run a pipeline through it, right? So we're kind of ground zero. We're the front line for this kind of colonial capitalist rapacity. But I would actually say it goes beyond Indigenous, just to a human experience at this point. I think that, with the kind of Occupy movement, with the work that Graeber did on debt, the way people are looking at capitalism now, so the sort of late necrotic capitalism, it's kind of an end of the age of empire. The sun is set on the empire, and there are economic ways of enforcing peonage, and it's been exacerbated by the pandemic. It's been exacerbated by these outside forces. But this kind of the spirit of unrest, which has disturbed the Buffalo Man in the movie, is still very present. It's ongoing, and I think it's ongoing even beyond a Native point of view. I think it's just a lot of American people have sort of woken up during the pandemic, and they've been disquieted by the face of the empire. And so I think it's actually the jig is kind of up for the colonial capitalist experiment. And I think it's time for a democratic experiment, it's a more egalitarian experiment to take place, which recognizes Indigenous rights and women's rights and transgendered rights and all these different people that have been sort of put on the back burner in the empire. I think now that there's a language, a conceptual language, and an experience, in art and through a discourse like this, which is actually, it's time. It's a kind of moment. It's a turning of the tide. It's changed the tide, right?
Yeah. Thank you, guys. Leah, do we have some questions from the audience?
Absolutely. So thank you very much, Diego and Mateo, and thank you, Bob. We're going to start transitioning into the Q&A portion here. We have Matthew, your hand is raised, so go ahead and unmute.
Thank you very much. And I want to start by, thanking Diego and Mateo for making this. I first saw the film, I think it was at MIAC, I don't know, 15 or more years ago, probably when I was a graduate student who studied with Bob Preucel. So I'm also an archaeologist, I have to admit here. And it was really, I remember it kind of smacked me in the face. I was just rolling through the galleries, checking things out. And it was really a bucket of cold water in the face in the best possible way. So really an important movie. I also, when I was a child, my favorite book was Pierre, the Maurice Sendak book. So maybe that's why it resonated with me. But my question for you guys was, you mentioned a couple of times how, it was 17 years ago and now we have all the discourse around decolonization. If you were to make a sequel to this today, what kind of questions would you be interested in asking, or what are the edgy, things you would do to push the museum world and world of anthropology, archaeology, if you were to make another one of these today?
Wow. I would certainly have to sit down with my brother and discuss it.
Sorry to put you on the spot. I should have given you a warning about that.
I guess we would talk about repatriation. I guess that would be the sequel, would be about getting some of these objects back, and we'd probably sit down, storyboard or blueprint a sequel of probably moving the hand of time up forward to probably the actual repatriation of some of these objects back into the ground. I don't know if it would be quite as funny or, but anyway, that I would start there. I guess that would be a good jumping off point, would be the actual repatriation. Maybe start with the Santa Fe riot.
Obelisk. Yeah.
The obelisk.
The obelisk. Maybe that would be the climactic point. We could reenact the pulling down of the obelisk in Santa Fe.
But anyway, to answer your question, I have no idea. I would just jump in and get the ball rolling. That's kind of how we did it with this piece here. It was
maybe we'd have references to Forrest Fenn's mythic treasuries buried that everyone dies trying to find, which people think is so charming, but I actually think it's kind of like shockingly in bad taste that you would bury some phony treasure somewhere and kill a bunch of people to go like search for it. You can have elements of that. I mean, people like looking for buried treasure and dying in the canyon up in Taos maybe, and I don't know. We had never thought of it. The Search of the Anasazi has no sequel. The Search of the Anasazi needs no sequel. There's enough mediocrity in the movie contained to last for generations. You could take it little sips of mediocrity as you go along. So like a single malt scotch, you could take a little sip at Christmas and a little sip at your birthday. And there's enough mendacity and mediocrity and half-baked ideas to last forever, I think. I mean, there needs to be no more of this level of film.
I mean, I'm shocked we're actually talking about this movie now, all this time later.
Thanks to Bob for dusting this one off, right?
Yeah.
From the vaults of the Haffner Museum.
Vault of YouTube. It's still there. Anybody can see it on YouTube. No, it's great.
I don't have a real life in American culture. I will say that something as kind of like quirky as this seems to have a little bit of a life, but beyond, even like a painting, right? Like you would think like the painting would have some kind of longevity, but they're long since, in someone's collection somewhere in some dimly lit hall. But something like videography has an ability to reach people on YouTube across, it has this kind of longevity, which is kind of shocking. That's what happens when you do an art show in a museum and you put in a video. I've done this a couple times, and people actually will they'll walk through a show and they'll spend like 5 minutes looking at the stuff that you spent like 9 months creating. And then they'll look at this video that you spent maybe a week doing, 2 days making. And they'll sit there. If it's a half-hour video, they'll get hypnotized by the moving image, and they'll sit there there'll be a crowd of people around a monitor looking at the video. And then you'll be like, what happened to all this beautiful stuff I made? And they'll just be like right in front of the video looking at it, and then they'll ask you questions just about that document. That's our culture, I guess. I guess we've been inoculated with video and film and photography, and people respond to it in a certain way. It's kind of ubiquitous.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. Thank you for sharing. We have a question here in the chat. And this question asks, speaking to the critiques from non-Pueblo educators, any advice for those Puebloan students who are currently experiencing these types of attacks upon our integrity as creators and experiences as Puebloans?
Stick to your guns.
I would tell people, I would tell Pueblo people to voice. So
stay true to yourself. Yep.
I have this discussion I have with I used to teach, my brother used to teach also, we're former instructors. And one of the ideas I had, which grew out of working with younger Native students, 18 and up, was that the Native voice is so important right now. It's come into its own in some respects. It's still nascent in others. There is a venue, there are many venues, with social media, for instance. But this idea of the voice, right? You live in a time now where Native people are getting the mic. You're getting the mic passed and to you. And I think to manifest the Native voice is the most important thing I can think of. I don't care what the message is. Like, I'm not for one speaker or against another person, but I would encourage all my students when I was teaching, manifest your voice, tell your story, put your message out there. The other thing I would tell them is, if you don't do this, that a white person pretending to be an Indian will step in front of you and take the mic. And whether you're trying to get a job teaching, or you're trying to publish, or you're trying to get your film produced, there are people referred to as, they call them pretendians now. I guess the term is pretendians. And there are people dying to take your story and take your place in your story. That's the final piece of a colonized experience, is when your voice disappears. You no longer are able to give your story. You're no longer able to give your point of view or perspective. That's the end result of colonization. It's the colonized mind. So I tell all Native students, I tell all Native people, tell your story. You know, just be fearless, tell your story. Are people going to throw stones at you? Sometimes. You know, are people going to have sticks for you? Sometimes. Are they going to encourage you? Sometimes. You know, people will, the message will not fall on deaf ears. Some people, it's such a polarized country at this point that some people will feel they have to attack you because of their political agenda, because of their ideology, because of racism. You know, this country is based in many ways on racism, and that carries through to today. So do you get attacked from telling your story? In some ways you do, but you also get supported by telling your story. People find you and they carry your message and elaborate on your message and put resource at your disposal. So that was my key idea as a teacher, and still is, to manifest Indigenous Native voice. And I don't care what the message is. It could be whatever you want it to be, but just say what it is for you and get it out there, and be fearless. Like my brother said, just be fearless, stick to your guns. Nothing happens without articulation of your position. Nothing happens without you telling your story. What happens when you tell your story? I don't know. But if you don't tell your story, nothing happens. If you want to know how to make a bad film, Diego and I will give you tips. You can come to us, we'll mentor you and how to make a film for $2,000, you know, like how to co-opt your students to film it, how to have bad editing, how to have like shitty references to like Murnau's Nosferatu.
Get your cousins as
Get your
actors.
cousins as actors, like press your relatives into, like, borrow your neighbor's horse and just get a bunch of jackalopes, Mexican pottery, and some old serapes, how to do it like on some ridiculous kind of like non-budget. You know, we could try to do that. That's art school 101. If this is anthro for dummies, you could be like film school for dummies, right?
That is all excellent advice, all of it. We do have time for one more question. Jay, you have your hand raised, so please unmute yourself.
Hello, thank you so much. That was great. I'm one of Bob Preucel's students now. We got to see some images of your pottery work last week in his class, and it was amazing. Congratulations on what you're doing. And I have a question about the film, and specifically the spirit of the land. And it's clear, I think, from your film, that the critique through the comedic aspects and the parody and all that, it's clear, you know, we don't want to be digging up artifacts, you know, willy-nilly and disturb the spirit of the land. At the same time, I'm here in Providence, and my permanent home is in Long Island, and we have plenty of state parks and national parks around us where there's no doubt that this is native land. And sometimes I wonder, you know, I'm not digging stuff up, but even just walking on native land and being in these areas, sacred spaces, in some sense, I imagine, but there are no signs, there are no buildings, there's nothing telling me as a hiker walking through the woods that you're on native land. And I guess it's kind of an open-ended question about the spirit of the land and how we can be respectful. Obviously not digging stuff up, but, you know, beyond that, you know, walking and enjoying, you know, an amazing hike through the woods. How can we make sure we're being respectful to the spirit of the land?
Well,
We can ask Marcus Hammerman. We'll put Marcus's email in the comments.
Just that you're, I mean, just, well, Well, thank God we aren't leaving our trash around, right? For starters, right? Okay, you could, so at least we come that far, right? People aren't leaving their soda cans or their candy bar wrappers out. So, you know, I guess, you know, in some ways, I mean, I guess it's all really kind of personal how you want to just really carry yourself through life, right? You know, whether you're gonna trod through the you know, arroyos of Santa Fe and leave your soda can behind, or whether you're gonna you know, pick up after yourself, or you know, and just you know, be respectful of you know, the people around you, and I guess the environment around you. I do think that we've come a long way. I was watching a movie the other night called Mad Men, and they have a picnic in the park, and they just take their blanket after they have the picnic, and they toss their trash in the park. And it's like, thank God, you know, we don't do that anymore, right? And you know, but to answer your question, I guess it's all really kind of very personal, right? You know, if you gotta figure that part out for yourself, how you want to just carry yourself, you know, in life, you know, with respect for just people or not, you know. I mean, unfortunately, you know, but I don't know. That's a pretty tough. Okay, I hope I hope that worked.
Thank you. Yeah, of course.
I'll give the Mateo the floor on that. Do you have any?
Sure. Well, I think that, you know, by asking the question, I think you've shown that you're a person with some sensitivity to it. I think Native cultures carry within them the potential to have sensitivity to the land, to the environment. As you know, once again, if you talk about global warming and the, you know, change in the environment and global climate change, and you talk about this sort of, you know, industrial kind of experience that America and the planet's going through right now, we're basically heating and cooling the planet through carbon emission and through methane and all this stuff. And so you're talking about a time when there's a growing awareness among Native and non-Native communities about the need to protect the environment. And I think Native communities have always had this. You know, Pueblo communities are agrarian, right? So they're very attuned to the landscape. In the Tewa Pueblo worldview, which is very closely linked to the Carries worldview, the idea of man and woman is not distinct from the environment. And the use of language, you know, if you look at some of the Tewa terms, Poha is breath of life. Breath of life moves through everything. It moves through stones and rocks, water, people, skies. If you look at man and woman's placement in the environment, it's not distinct from the landscape. It's part of the breath of life. It's incorporated in the landscape. The Western European idea that I studied in art history was sublime. You know, the sublime is a distinct position apart from the landscape. The man and woman are observers. They're distinct, and they observe the sublime in nature. They're moved by the experience, right? But in the Rio Grande Pueblo worldview, there's not a distinction. You're not distinct from the landscape. You're experiencing the landscape in the landscape as part of the landscape. And that's essential to agrarian people. It's essential to Pueblo people. It's ideas, ideology based on harmony and balance, being connected to the land. Ideas of migration are embedded in Pueblo values, emergence from underworld to this world, migration across this area. The idea of moisture is essential to the Pueblo people. The idea of rain falling, you know, the idea of snow as being a manifestation of rain in winter. It's based on summer and winter clan ideology, which is recognized through moiety in the Rio Grande Pueblos. In the dance sequences, there's a symbol where the dancers, the choirmen, look out and they see rain clouds coming in, moisture falls, corn grows, right? Those are essential movements from the choirmen. And those are all ideologically linked to man, woman, environment, space. So that would be, my thoughts on it would be that if you're already attuned to it, then you're already sensitive to it. And, that's a huge part of it. That's a lot of it. That's the vast majority of it. I think the rest of it is just sort of details on how people on a personal level interacts with the planet, the space. The heart of indigeneity is humanity, right? It's not about some kind of cultural experience that sort of frames you, but it's about connecting with other people and connecting with the land.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you both. I think we're almost at time, and I think we ought to end this by thanking you both. And I just want to make a comment about the two of you as a pair. And you know that pairs are important in Pueblo culture, not just dualities, not just oppositions, but pairs, the hero twins, the war chiefs, Amtua and Katua, the Tewa boys who were the messengers for the Pueblo Revolt, who ran from village to village. You two are the Chongo Brothers. You are a pair that are leading us forward and bringing these issues to our attention and helping us chart a new future. So we really appreciate your comments here, your artwork, and we thank you for being part of our program tonight.
You're very kind. We're just artists, but thank you. Thanks for those kind words. Thanks for having us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.